Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Poetry Thursday, a little BookTube event in which some of the coolest channels out there read you a poem on Thursday, and occasionally maybe even talk about it, or in my case, talk about it a great deal. I am reading my way through one anthology, this thing, 20th Century American Poetry, edited by Dana Gioia, David Mason, and Meg Shirky. A big fat anthology that I bought a couple of years ago, and specifically because its very title challenges some old held beliefs of mine. That's always a good idea, to challenge your old held beliefs. I have always held that 20th century American poetry, as a title of a book, is also a description of a time period in which poetry died as a popular genre, in which it didn't just die but was intentionally murdered. and the call is coming from inside the house. uh, I still believe that. I think that's just objectively true. Most modern poetry is incomprehensible garbage, and as a result, most modern readers don't read it. Uh, doesn't need to be that way, but nevertheless, that's a subject for another time. That day is coming, but not here yet. I'm reading my way through this book in order to reclaim some poets that maybe I did not, that maybe I dismissed with the bathwater, and also to rejoice in some of them. And along the way, it has given me a chance to talk to you about the various qualities of anthologies, positive and negative. Any anthology is going to have them. Your editors are going to have a lot to say. They aren't just going to be impersonally pulling stuff together. They may have too much to say, as in the 100-year anniversary of poetry in the New Yorker, or they may have too little to say. They may be trying to absent themselves from the process altogether and just make a consensus thing, and that will be a big volume like the 100 most beloved poems of all time, something like that, that has very little in the way of editorial discretion where you might want some. Also, there will be cases where, through Byzantine connections that you don't know anything about, maybe one of the editors is beholden to a poet or a person in their anthology and so includes them. Maybe in a less nefarious way, maybe an editor has just been deeply influenced by a poet that is minor or that has been completely forgotten. They want to make sure they're in their anthology. They're paying it forward. You have to pay attention to those sorts of things. You don't have to obsess on them, but you have to pay attention to them because they will explain the odd percentages. They will explain the balance of any anthology that you read, good or bad. Those are the elements that will explain that. So we have noticed a whole bunch of that, a whole bunch of things like that in our this ongoing melodrama of Poetry Thursday. And today we are up to Muriel Rukeyser, who maybe a lot of you won't be familiar with. You should be. She is perhaps the last of the true warrior poets. And a quintessential example, the example that comes to mind whenever you hear anyone say, well, you walk the walk, you talk the talk, but do you walk the walk? Are you willing to put your money where your mouth is? She was an incredibly impressive figure in her art, in her poetry, in her nonfiction, in her fiction, in her journal writing, also in the stuff that had in her life that had nothing to do with literature. She was an incredibly impressive figure. And if you want to learn more about her, well, fortunately, you have 3 or 4 800-page, highly detailed biographies in Hebrew, if you read Hebrew, or maybe some of them have been translated into English. And also you will have 8 or 9 really good, in-depth biographies that are published in the English market, in the English language market here in America and in the Oh, no, you won't. You won't have any of that. No, you won't have any of that. I guess you can pull together scraps and pieces, and if you've got a little free time on your hands, maybe contact the holders of her literary remains and write a biography like that. Because we can certainly do with one Muriel Rukeyser biography for the 50 Abraham Lincoln biographies that existed in the last 50 years. We certainly deserve a Muriel Rukeyser biography before we deserve an Elon Musk biography. But anyway, one of the oddities of an anthology that you're just going to have to live with. I think this is a very good anthology. I've come to fall in love with it as I've been spending a lot of time with it. But one of the qualities that you have to just deal with is that sometimes the proportions aren't going to strike you as right. For instance, I think that Muriel Rukeyser is as oddly underserved in this anthology as some far less worthy poets have been overserved. It's just the way the game breaks. You just have to deal with it. We have, in this anthology, I think there are 4 poems. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, there are 4 poems here. That's too few. And I would argue that with one exception, her greatest poetry is not touched on here, even in excerpt. But I'm going to read you 2 out of the 4. Not because all 4 shouldn't be read, but because 2 are easier to read than they are to read out loud. So the first one that I want to read you is was incredibly famous. It was for a long time synonymous with her as a poet. And it is called To Be a Jew in the 20th Century. To be a Jew in the 20th century is to be offered a gift. If you refuse, wishing to be invisible, you choose death of the spirit, the stone insanity. Accepting, take full life, full agonies, your evening deep in labyrinthine blood of those who resist, fail, and resist, and God reduced to a hostage among hostages. The gift is torment, not alone the still torture, isolation, or torture of the flesh. That may come also, but the accepting wish, the whole and fertile spirit as guarantee for every human freedom, suffering to be free, daring to live for the impossible. That was written in 1944. And it's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And I think there are a lot of people, especially a lot of Jewish thinkers, Jewish writers, who would resonate incredibly personally with a lot of lines in there as reflecting what it means to be a Jew in the 20th century, as what it means to be a Jew at all. The whole fruit and fertile spirit as guarantee for every human freedom, suffering to be free, daring to live for the impossible. Of course, Muriel Rukeyser couldn't possibly have known that that subject would be unbearably complicated after she was dead. And Jewish readers and Jewish writers, Jewish thinkers need to deal with that now. They need to deal with that in the 21st century. Because it is an undeniable truth that one of the greatest crimes against humanity in the 20th century was done to the Jews, to Jewish people. And one of the greatest crimes against humanity in the 21st century is currently being done by Jews. And they have the same root in the 20th century and the 21st. The root is that the people doing the atrocity have convinced themselves that the people they're doing the atrocity to are not human. So all the talk that Muriel Rukeyser spent her whole life giving this talk and caring a lot about this subject in a lot of nuanced ways, hence maybe the absence of biographies, about the fact that never again, the famous slogan, never again, responded not only to no more of pogroms, no other Shoah, but also to the Jews will never do that again. The Jews themselves will never other someone to the point of making a massacre possible. And the Jewish government of Israel is doing that right now. And the crime against humanity in the 20th century that was done to the Jews was done largely with the forbearing silence of the rest of the watching world. And so too in the 21st century, with the crime against humanity being done by Jews to other people, people they have declared to be less than human. Go on over there, maybe you could do it. That kind of element runs strongly through a lot of Muriel Rukeyser's writing, including a lot of her prose. I think that poem, though, regardless of where you stand on the subject, that you do not need to agonize over Jewish identity in order to love this writer. This is a great writer, that probably the greatest writer you've never heard of, and you will love the poetry. I think probably the earlier poetry more than the later poetry, although oddly enough, I think the later poem that we're going to read is better than this one, even though this one is more famous. This one is broken up. I don't know if you could tell from my reading, but the lines, the individual stanzas are broken up. They're split in two. And the two halves of the two lines, of the two or three lines at the beginning of each stanza, comment on each other as much as they forward the rhyme scheme, which is pretty interesting. That is pretty interesting to do. It's a pretty interesting poem to analyze, quite apart from reading it and responding to it emotionally. I like it a lot. I like also the context. It is it's a segment of a longer work. It works fine on its own, but That was my frustration with Rukeyser in this book, is that she's picked and pecked when lesser writers than her, who happen to have greater reputations and who happen to be men, are given their context, and they're given you get a lot more of them. I wish there were more of her in here. I wish those 800-page biographies existed so that I could read them and recommend them to you. But I want to read you another poem. This one is from 30 years later, and it's just called Poem, and it also is famous. There are a handful of her poems that are famous. I recommend them all. Find a collected poetry, or I think 30 or 40 years ago, there was a thing called the Muriel Rukeyser Reader. No one's ever updated it. No one's ever done another one. No one's ever done a biography. There is no big new annotated verse. There is no big new annotated prose collection. There is nothing like that. for this valorous figure, for this fighter in the dark, for this light in the shadows. There is nothing like that. It's a terrible, terrible shame. But you'll find bits and pieces out there. You should go and see how many of you can find. But let's read one more poem from Muriel Rukeyser. One more poem. And when you do piece together little bits and pieces of her biography, shameful that I have to say this, when we have 50 Ezra Pound biographies. An anti-Semite, someone who would have easily seen Muriel Rukeyser put to death and not even cared about it. In fact, it would have picked up his day. Anyway. Or yesterday, I did a book called Yesterday, a biography of Robert Lowell. A worthy figure, an interesting figure, a patch, a fraction of Muriel Rukeyser. Actually, a big fan of Ezra Pound, but a friend of his met Muriel Rukeyser and said, she's exhausting in the best possible way. She makes me feel lazy. When you read little bits and pieces of her biography, she will make you feel not only lazy, but cowardly. And that's good for you. That's good for you. Feel those things and then do something about it. Because that was the quintessential challenge, rhetorical question at the heart of her life. She was very warm, very loving, not very confrontational except to evildoers. But the quintessential posed question in her life, the one she almost never said to anybody, was, well, what are you going to do about it? Anyway, let's read one more poem. Another poem that is famous. I'll try to do it justice, although my poem readings don't do it justice. This is just called Poem, and it's from 1968. I lived in the first century of world wars. Most mornings I would be more or less insane. The newspapers would arrive with their careless stories. The news would pour out of various devices, interrupted by attempts to sell products to the unseen. I would call my friends on other devices. They would be more or less mad for similar reasons. Slowly I would get to pen and paper, make my poems for others unseen and unborn. In the day I would be reminded of those men and women, brave, setting up signals across vast distances, considering a nameless way of living, of almost unimagined values. As the lights darkened and the lights of the night brightened, we would try to imagine them, try to find each other, to construct peace, to make love, to reconcile waking with sleeping, ourselves with each other, ourselves with ourselves. We would try by any means to reach the limits of ourselves, to reach beyond ourselves, to let go the means to wake. I lived in the first century of these wars. That's from 1968. And the stereotypical tagline of poetry is that it's news that stays news. I have always thought that was a little trite, and of course, obviously untrue. More importantly, really good poetry is truth that stays true. And most mornings would be more or less insane. The newspapers would arrive with their careless stories. The news would pour out of various devices, making you mad, making you crazy. And you would reach out to others, trying to forge some sort of connection, trying to reconcile sleeping with waking. Are you going to tell me you don't feel that now, in 2025? You do. Not because this poem is particularly prescient, but because it's real. Because it speaks truth. And truth doesn't go away. I think it's lovely. It's of course not as structural as I would like. It's not as structured as I would like. Muriel Rukeyser lost a lot. She abandoned a lot of that as her poetry went on. I can't really fault it in someone like her, especially if it's this effective. But I like the way this poem could have been written today by a poet that you should know better. She's surrounded on both sides of this anthology by poets that you do know better and who aren't as good. So, and we're going to hit one of those tomorrow. Or not tomorrow, next Thursday. So I'll wrap this up for now. That is your Poetry Thursday for this week. A figure I am overjoyed to introduce you to if I did. Wish I had things to recommend to you, but I don't. Anyway, I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.